A lot of FASO students have to complete an assignment where you write about 2 or occasionally 3 texts, and it can have different names. If you're in arts and culture or in European studies, you probably know it as a compare and contrast essay. If you're in global studies, you might know it as a reading report. If you're an MA student, you might have come across mention of a position paper or a discussion paper. Basically, all of those we're looking for the same kind of thing. They're all the same kind of text. What they have in common is that you're going to read 2 or perhaps 3 articles. You might have selected those articles yourself based on a topic that you're addressing. They might have been given to you, or you might have been given one and asked to choose a second to go with it. So they're connected in some way. But most of the time, the authors of the texts that you're looking at don't actually know that they're connected to each other. They might, know each other's names as other authors in the field, but they're not writing to each other. It's you that's making the connection between these 2 texts, because those authors have addressed a similar issue, they've addressed the issue in the same way, they have similar concerns, they disagree in a particular debate or whatever. So your task is to write about the issue by drawing on those 2 texts, not to write about the texts. And actually, we're all familiar with PBL. When you think about a PBL tutorial, you know how the PBL tutorial works. You've got an issue. Your tutor is going to bring an issue to the tutorial. There's going to be some material in the course book where we say, okay, today it's all about this issue, and you look at it, and together as a group you're going to formulate some learning goals around this issue. And then you're going to go away, and in the time between this tutorial and the next tutorial, if you're doing classic PBL, then in step 6 you're going to do that reading so that you come back to the next tutorial for the post-discussion, and you're going to, in the post-discussion, you're not going to say, here are the articles that I read, I'm going to summarize them. You're not going to say, I read 2 articles and I found 5 similarities and 3 differences. You're going to say, we had some learning goals, and by studying these texts, we've come nearer to addressing those learning goals, to learning about the issue. It's not about the texts, it's about using the texts to achieve the learning goals. And any kind of call it a compare and contrast essay, call it a reading report, it's really about the same thing as a PBL tutorial. It's about addressing an issue. So in class, when you do PBL, you've got a pre-discussion where you become aware, thanks to your tutor or the course coordinator, you become aware of an issue in society, a debate or whatever. And your job then, as a group, together, guided by your chair, is to formulate some learning goals. And then you read the texts. And then you come back and you have that post-discussion where you clarify together what you've understood, how the texts relate to the goals, how you see the issue in the light of what you've read, and what you want to think about that particular topic. And we're all familiar with that. If you've done PBL, that's how it goes. When you have to write that task comparing those 2 texts, think of it as PBL in writing. So this time you're going to read the texts first. You come at those texts blind. But before you start writing, you're going to think, what could be the issue or the debate that holds these 2 texts together? And so you might think, why on earth might somebody want to use these 2 texts? What might be the learning goals? What question can these texts answer? And then you come on to the writing, where, as we saw with the post-discussion, you're going to clarify in writing now on your own how we can understand these texts, how they relate to the issues that you identified, how you can see that issue, and what we should think about that topic, which is very, very similar to what happens in a PBL tutorial. So, how are we going to go about this? You've got your text. The first thing to do is to identify a common theme. Look at those two articles, maybe first of all read them through quickly. Some people read all the way through the first article and think about it, and then read all the way through the second. But maybe it's a good idea to just skim through the first article, think about it, skim through the second article, think about it, see what they have in common, look at them in a bit more detail, and you begin to get a feel for, you know, what is the debate, what is the issue that these articles have in common, that they're both authors are speaking to some debate, although in different ways. And then, I'd like you to imagine these two authors, who perhaps never met before, and they meet in a train carriage. You know, one of them says to the other, hang on, aren't you so-and-so who wrote that article? Yeah, I said, oh, and you're so, yeah, and you're so-and-so, oh, well, nice to meet you. And then they get talking. What are they going to talk about? Obviously, they're not going to summarize their articles very much. They're not going to be saying, oh, well, there are 3 differences and 2 similarities in what we're saying. They're going to have a much more interesting discussion than that. They're going to build on, they're going to use the ideas that they've both brought to find some kind of a solution. So that's your first task, is to try and find what would those authors be thinking about if they met like that. And then, at this stage, your objective is to try to construct a kind of a PBL learning goal or objective, that if these papers were at stage 6, in between the pre-discussion and the post-discussion, what is it that these papers would help you to learn? So let's go back to those authors who are sitting in their train carriage and they're talking very animatedly. What would they be talking about? Would they be trying to find common ground? If they disagreed with each other, maybe they would be trying to resolve their differences. Would they be perhaps highlighting some problems that arise in their analysis? Maybe if they bounce ideas off each other, they might have some new thoughts. They might say, oh, well, what about this? They might both have written those articles a few years ago, and they might say, oh, well, you know, what happened last week or last month? That's an example of what I was saying. And the other might say, exactly, yes, and that would mean that. Or, but, no, I don't agree with you there. Maybe it would mean that. And so, what would we do next? What would we think? How do we go forward? So we're looking at the issue out in the real world, and those texts are a path that helps us to explore that issue. And so, very often, the best way, don't start with, okay, here's the text I'm going to discuss. Start with the debate. Now, here are some examples you can see on the slide. This one, the first one, we see in green. This is the topic, the glass ceiling and women's inequality in the workplace. And then we can see it's a topic that has been, and I've put these in italics, extensively. Extensively means it's an important topic. And the word discussed, which I've underlined, says there is a debate. Scholars don't agree. So we've got, in that opening sentence, we've got those 3 elements. What is the topic? Is it popular? Is there disagreement? And, you know, there's a huge variety of sentences that you can produce. But ideally, it's nice to see those 3 elements. Here's another example. This one starts with a question. The topic is framed as a question. But again, we see there are scholarly opinions, which differ from each other, presumably. And when we see vary considerably, there's a lot of different. And so it becomes interesting. It's an interesting debate. There's one further. We can see there how that one is. This one starts with, there is a lot of debate. and presents the topic last. So, in this particular exercise, whatever kind of exercise, whether it's a compare and contrast paper or a position paper or whatever, you will need to summarize. But unlike the kind of summarizing exercises you've done previously, it's going to be a very short summary. We want to know the broad topic and the specific focus of each article. We want to know the main argument, because that's why the author wrote that main argument. But when you're doing a more detailed summary, typically you're going to be showing how the sub-arguments build towards the main argument. We don't need that here. We haven't got space. What we need here is for you to just mention any of the supporting arguments that the author has made that are going to come back in your discussion, so that later on when you're doing that discussion you don't have to stop and say, okay, let me summarize some more. If there are parts of the author's paper that are not relevant, that you're not going to discuss because they don't align with the other author, don't mention those at all. Save space. And you've got to respond to your material. And we've got a very simple example here, the sort of thing that you might have in primary school. You're comparing cats with dogs. Okay, so the text says, we can see on the left-hand side, the text says, dogs require a lot of attention, cats look after themselves. You haven't actually done anything with your text unless you say, for example, this means that, and then that's coming from you. You're commenting on the material. Another example, we might be comparing, for whatever reason, the virtues and disadvantages of paper bags and plastic bags, and the material from the text tells us on one hand, plastic bags, as we knew, really cause a lot of pollution, get into the oceans, and paper, as perhaps we weren't so aware, really costs a lot of energy to produce, far more than plastic does. So, don't just leave it there, make a response where you say, well, that might mean this. And that's you putting yourself into the text. That's you contributing then to that discussion, and that's why sometimes we call it a position paper, because we see the positions of the author, author one, author two, but we also see your position in relation to those authors. And so wrapping up at the end, here are some phrases that you might want to be using to draw to a close when you're coming to the end of your analysis. And then a good paper of this type looks forward and says, okay, so what now? Again, here we can see some examples of how you might wrap up. You might address issues. You might say, well, neither author really thinks about this one. What about's happened recently? What should we think about that? Should we be concerned here? Offering an opportunity for further debate. And later on, you'll go on from writing this comparison of 2 or 3 texts to writing a comparison of many texts when you write a literature review. And when you write a literature review, there's always going to be this requirement that at the end you say, that leaves space for my research. So similarly, with this comparison of 2 texts, it's nice if you can say, but there are questions that remain unanswered. We could do more research. We could discuss this further. How do you want to divide it up? This is very, very approximate. Good idea to talk to your tutor. It might vary from one program to another, but if you look at that one, if we start at 12 o'clock, the blue there, that's kind of the debate, the lead-in, couple of very brief summaries. The really interesting bit is that orange bit where you're actually discussing and debating the ideas, and then that grey bit is the last 10% of your paper, where you say, okay, well, that means that, and this is the way forward, and now maybe we should think about that. So, very approximately, how to divide up your paper. There you go. We're done.